The district court stood like an ancient sentinel, its towering white stone pillars casting long shadows under the morning sun. Every day, it bore witness to the full spectrum of justice, from minor infractions to cases that rocked the state to its core. The grand hallway was paved with marble, the pale yellow light reflecting off its gleaming surface, giving the space a solemn yet cold atmosphere. People moved with purpose: lawyers, court clerks, defendants, and visitors. Among them was Officer Damian Burke, striding through the crowd with confidence bordering on arrogance. A tall, sharply dressed figure, Burke wore his uniform like armor, his badge gleaming under the lights. His eyes were sharp, cold, and devoid of warmth. His presence demanded attention and fear. To Burke, the courthouse was not a temple of justice, but an extension of his dominance. He had spent years cultivating connections within the police force, which allowed him to use excessive force, intimidate suspects, and bend the rules with impunity. Complaints against him never went anywhere. His colleagues covered for him, his superiors looked the other way, and his victims were silenced. Damian Burke believed he was untouchable. That morning, Burke was scheduled to testify in a routine case. Another day to assert control, to reinforce his illusion of superiority. As he marched through the corridor, a woman accidentally brushed against him. The contact was light, almost negligible, but Damian stopped instantly. He frowned, turning sharply. The woman didn't flinch, didn't apologize, and didn't avert her gaze. She stood tall in a tailored black suit, her posture graceful yet assertive. Her skin glowed under the hallway lights, her long hair tied back neatly, and her eyes, they were calm, focused, and utterly unimpressed. "Do you have eyes?" Burke barked. "You bumped into a police officer and don't even say sorry." Murmurs spread through the hallway. Court staff and onlookers slowed their steps, sensing a confrontation. "It wasn't intentional," the woman replied, her voice low and composed. There was no fear in her tone, no hint of submission. Burke's eyes narrowed. That wasn't the response he was used to. Most people stammered apologies or shrank away. Not her. Not intentional. You think that's enough? I could arrest you right now. Obstructing an officer. Causing a disturbance. You want to see how far that gets you? She didn't blink. Instead, she gave him a faint, enigmatic smile. Her silence unnerved him. Burke's frustration mounted, and the bystanders were clearly intrigued. Then a firm voice cut through the tension. "Damian, stand down." All eyes turned. Sheriff Lionel Grayson stood at the far end of the hallway. A veteran lawman with salt and pepper hair and a hardened face. He was holding a thick file and walking briskly toward them. His eyes flicked to the woman, then to Burke, carrying something sharp, a warning. Burke blinked. The sheriff looked nervous. "That never happened. Boss, I'm dealing with an issue here," Burke said, tone still defiant. "Shut your mouth," Sheriff Grayson snapped. Burke recoiled slightly. He had never heard the sheriff speak like that. His stomach turned with unease. Then the woman spoke. "It seems Officer Burke doesn't know who I am." Her words were calm, but every syllable rang with quiet authority. Grayson stepped forward, visibly sweating now. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were visiting today. My sincerest apologies." Burke looked between them, utterly lost. "Who is she?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. Grayson turned to him slowly. "That is Evelyn Monroe, the Attorney General of this state." The name hit Burke like a punch to the gut. Evelyn Monroe. The woman who had spearheaded the takedown of 3 corrupt police precincts. The prosecutor who had built cases against dirty cops, judges, and even state senators. She was the very embodiment of justice and retribution. Damian's mouth went dry. Monroe turned her gaze back to him. "We'll be seeing each other again soon. But next time, I'll be the one asking the questions." Her voice, soft yet commanding, froze him in place. With that, she walked away, her heels clicking on the marble, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was almost deafening. The moment passed, but Burke remained rooted, haunted by what had just transpired. The real nightmare began the next morning. Inside the glass-walled conference room of the Attorney General's office, Evelyn Monroe stood at the head of the table, her team assembled before her. "Let's begin," she said. "What do we have on Officer Damian Burke?" Investigator Marcus Lane opened his laptop. "We have years of abuse complaints. Most were dismissed or buried. He has personal ties with senior officers and judges. Reports of excessive force, added another investigator. Victims with broken bones, bruised faces. Internal affairs never followed up. Bribery. Possibly, Lane said, tapping on his keyboard. We found suspicious transactions, money from shell companies linked to criminal networks. Monroe folded her arms. I want every victim's name. Every cover-up. We'll bring him down with the truth. That same afternoon, a sealed envelope was delivered to Burke's office. It bore the Attorney General's seal. He read it, hands trembling. Summons. He felt the blood drain from his face. The interrogation room was stark. 2 metal chairs. A ticking wall clock. Burke sat with his hands clenched. Evelyn Monroe entered, a thick folder in hand. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she laid the folder on the table and opened it slowly. Officer Burke, she said, voice cold. Let's talk about what you did. Burke tried to remain composed, but as she read the list of names, the accusations, the financial statements, his resolve cracked. She laid down bank records, statements from former colleagues, and transcripts of his victims' testimonies. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the illusion of control he had lived under for years. Peter Greaves, Michael Lang, Thomas Brody, Monroe listed. They all confessed, and they all named you. Burke broke. It's not what you think. They're lying. I was just doing my job. Beating suspects unconscious, taking bribes from gangs, covering up trafficking rings. She leaned in. You were never untouchable, Damien. Just lucky. That luck has run out. The media exploded. Headlines blared across the state. Attorney General launches probe into Officer Burke's alleged abuses. Statewide outrage over years of police misconduct. Victims speak out. We thought no one would listen. Public anger swelled. Burke was suspended. His trial was fast-tracked. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Dozens of Burke's victims filled the front rows, some weeping quietly. Burke sat at the defendant's table, hollow-eyed. Judge Daniel Hawthorne opened the trial. Charges were read: bribery, abuse of power, excessive force, obstruction of justice. Evidence flooded in: video, audio, financial records, testimonies. The final blow came when Peter Greaves, once Burke's closest ally, took the stand and recounted in grim detail the crimes they had committed together. The jury returned swiftly. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Judge Hawthorne delivered the sentence: 8 years in prison without parole. Burke slumped in his chair. As 2 officers approached to escort him out, he looked across the room. Evelyn Monroe stood silently near the exit. Their eyes met. She said only one thing: no one is above the law. Then she turned and walked away. Justice had spoken, and the man who once believed himself untouchable would now spend 8 years behind bars. A warning to all who thought the badge meant immunity from consequences. 6 months later, Evelyn Monroe sat quietly in her office as the sun dipped below the skyline. The news report on her screen showed a new state initiative, a sweeping reform of the police oversight system, with stricter internal audits and civilian review boards gaining real power. It bore her signature. But something more personal waited on her desk: a letter. It was from one of Burke's victims, a single mother whose life had been destroyed when her son was falsely imprisoned. She had watched the entire trial from the front row. Thank you, it read, for making us believe in justice again. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, eyes misty but resolute. Justice wasn't just about one trial, one officer, one sentence. It was a promise, and it had to be kept, no matter the cost.